He bought a broken house to start over with his 3 daughters. Everyone laughed, saying he'd never finish it. But one night, while he was too sick to keep working, his daughters found something hidden inside the wall, something that changed everything. Watch what happened next. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The cold that morning was the kind that seeped through gloves, through denim, through the thin resolve of a man who had already lost more than he could count. Frost lined the edges of the truck windshield, and Thomas Gray leaned forward from the driver's seat, breathing a white cloud onto the glass before wiping it away with the sleeve of his worn jacket. In the back seat, his 3 daughters were huddled beneath a blanket that smelled faintly of smoke and soap. Sophia, the oldest, had her arms around Emma, who in turn held little Lily close. The heater had long stopped working, and their breaths hung in the air like ghosts of the life they used to have. Thomas turned the key in the ignition once, twice, until the engine coughed itself awake. The sound was harsh in the morning silence. He rubbed his eyes and exhaled heavily. The last 3 nights had been the same, sleeping in the truck behind an abandoned gas station, counting coins before dawn, trying not to let the girls see the weight in his chest. He told them they were camping, that it was only for a little while, but even Lily, only 6, had stopped pretending. The paper on the dashboard was creased and dirty, but the advertisement was still legible. Old 2-story house for sale. Private property. Needs repair. Symbolic price. It sounded like a joke or a trap. Yet the thought had followed him for days, hovering somewhere between desperation and hope. By the time they reached the address, the sun had lifted just above the frozen rooftops. The house stood at the end of a narrow street, where the asphalt gave way to gravel and frost-bitten weeds. It looked almost skeletal. A sagging porch, shattered windows, the paint stripped down to splinters. The roof dipped in the middle, as if bowing under the weight of its own years. A stray dog ran across the yard, disappearing into the bushes. Sophia pressed her forehead to the window and whispered, "Is this it?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah, this is it." They stepped out. The air smelled of iron and damp earth. Emma kicked at a loose board on the porch, and it broke apart with a hollow crack. Lily looked up at her father, eyes wide. "Will it fall on us?" "Not if we help it stand," Thomas said, forcing a smile. He touched the porch post with a craftsman's instinct rotten on the surface, but solid underneath. He could tell. Wood had a memory, and he had spent half his life listening to it. The realtor arrived late, shivering and irritated, holding a clipboard. "Nobody wants this place," she said. "Roof leaks, basement floods. Neighbors say it's haunted. If you want it, you can take it off our hands. Just sign the waiver. No refunds, no repairs." Thomas barely listened. He walked through each room slowly, letting his boots echo on the dusty floorboards. In the kitchen, he found a rusted sink and a cupboard door that hung by a single hinge. On the wall, a faded photograph still clung to the plaster. A man, a woman, and a small child, standing on the same porch, decades earlier. Their faces were blurred, but the feeling wasn't. The place carried a heartbeat, weak but persistent. When he came back outside, the realtor was stamping her feet impatiently. "So, Mr. Gray, yes or no?" He looked at his daughters, Sophia with her cautious eyes, Emma with her restless curiosity, and Lily clutching a broken toy horse, and something inside him settled. "Yes," he said quietly. "We'll take it." The woman blinked. "You're serious?" "More than I've ever been." The papers were signed within the hour. The house was theirs for less than the cost of a single month's rent. But as they stood before it, keys in hand, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on all of them. The front door groaned open with a sound like a sigh. The first night, they slept on the floor of the living room, wrapped in old blankets. The wind slipped through the cracks and made the walls creak. Thomas fed bits of wood into the iron stove until the fire finally caught, and warmth, thin, flickering, fragile, began to crawl through the room. The girls huddled close together, whispering stories to keep themselves awake. When dawn came, Thomas was already outside, hammer in hand. The ground was hard with frost, the sky pale. He started with the roof patching where he could, measuring where he couldn't. Every nail he drove in sounded like a heartbeat, slow and steady. He worked until his hands went numb, then worked some more. The neighbors watched from their porches. One of them, an older man in a wool cap, shook his head and laughed. "You're better off tearing it down," he called out. "That place'll eat you alive." Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow and looked up. "Then I'll eat it back," he said simply, and went back to work. Days turned into weeks. The house began to change, subtly at first. A replaced window, a sealed crack, the faint smell of soap where there had been mildew. The girls helped in their own ways. Sophia learned to paint walls, careful and methodical, her hair tied up in her mother's old bandana. Emma sorted nails and screws, keeping count like a small accountant. Lily collected fallen leaves and glued them into the shape of hearts, taping them to the kitchen wall, so the house wouldn't feel sad. They ate what they could afford: bread, boiled potatoes, canned beans, sometimes soup made from whatever Thomas brought home from a construction site's leftovers. He taught them how to make tea from pine needles and honey, and they drank it from mismatched mugs around the fire. At night, when the girls were asleep, he would sit alone on the porch, listening to the creak of the beams and the low hum of the wind through the trees. He found himself talking to the house in whispers, as if it could understand. "You're still standing," he'd murmur. "So am I. Let's not give up on each other." There were setbacks. One storm tore off part of the roof he had just repaired. The water ruined the upstairs hallway. For a moment, standing under the dripping ceiling, Thomas wanted to throw the hammer against the wall and scream. But then he saw the girls watching from the stairs, silent and afraid, and he forced a tired smile. "Good thing I still have a few nails left," he said. "We'll fix it before dinner." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was real. Winter bled into early spring. The snow melted, revealing patches of muddy earth around the house. Thomas planted a small garden, more symbolic than practical potatoes, onions, a few seeds he found in an old drawer. He told the girls it was good luck to let something grow near a house you're rebuilding. Sophia rolled her eyes but helped anyway. By the time the trees began to bud, the house had begun to find its rhythm again. The floors no longer moaned under every step. The windows reflected light instead of dust. There was still a long way to go, but the laughter of 3 girls now filled the air where silence once lived. At night, Thomas would stand by the window and look at their sleeping faces, the shadows of their breaths rising and falling in unison. He thought of his late wife, her voice, her hands, the way she used to hum while cooking, and whispered to the darkness, "I'm doing what I can, Annie. They'll have a home again." Outside, the wind brushed against the walls, not with menace, but with something gentler, like acknowledgement. The house seemed to listen. When the first heavy rain of spring came, it didn't leak through the roof this time. Thomas stood beneath the eaves, watching the water pour safely down the gutters, and felt something break loose inside him, a small knot of fear that had lived in his chest for too long. He knew the work was far from over. There would be more storms, more repairs, more nights of exhaustion. But for the first time in years, he felt the quiet pulse of hope. That night, as the girls slept, he walked through every room, touching the walls with a carpenter's reverence, the old beams, the uneven floors, the faint scent of smoke and soap. It all felt alive again. He whispered to himself before turning out the lamp. This is our beginning. The wind moved softly through the half-fixed shutters, and somewhere deep inside the old frame, the house answered back with a slow, settling creak, as if to say it believed him. The weeks that followed unfolded in a blur of gray mornings and long, brittle nights. Spring had not yet settled in, and the ground outside the house was still half frozen, holding the memory of winter in its veins. Thomas woke every day before sunrise, his body already aching before his boots even touched the floor. The hammer and saw had become extensions of his hands, the rhythm of work the only heartbeat that kept him from falling apart. He worked for a contractor down by the industrial district during the day, patching roofs and pouring concrete for barely enough to buy groceries and a few planks for their own house. In the evenings, when the light softened and the air grew sharp again, he returned home to mend what time and neglect had broken. Inside the house, things were changing slowly, almost imperceptibly. The wind still whistled through the smallest cracks, but there was warmth in the kitchen now, a smell of food that reminded him of something close to peace. Sophia had learned to cook simple meals, boiled potatoes, thin soup with beans, sometimes scrambled eggs when there was enough to spare. Emma swept the floors and counted the nails her father kept in a coffee tin, writing down the numbers in a notebook as if they were treasure. Little Lily followed him everywhere, small footsteps echoing his heavy ones, her hands always sticky with glue and dust from the paper hearts she taped to the walls. Thomas often thought of his late wife, Anna. He could see her in the way Sophia held a spoon, in Emma's habit of humming to herself while she worked, in Lily's tendency to talk to the house as if it were a living thing. Some nights, when the house grew quiet, he caught himself turning toward the empty chair near the stove, expecting to see her there with a cup of tea and that knowing smile. Then reality came back like a tide, and he reminded himself that memories were not meant to warm you. They were meant to test whether you could still feel the cold. He had begun to cough, a dry, harsh sound that scraped at his throat. He ignored it at first. There was always another beam to secure, another leak to seal, another day to outlast. But as the days stretched into weeks, the fatigue began to pull at him like gravity. His chest felt heavy in the mornings, his head throbbed by noon, and the muscles in his back ached with a dull, steady rhythm. He kept working anyway. Stopping meant thinking, and thinking led nowhere he wanted to go. One evening, after a particularly long day, he returned home drenched in rain. The storm had rolled in quickly, pounding against the patched windows and the newly sealed roof. Inside, the girls were waiting, their faces glowing in the flicker of the small oil lamp on the table. Sophia had made soup. Its thin aroma of onions and broth filled the air. "Sit down, Papa," she said gently. "You're shaking." He waved her off and went to check the roof again. "I just want to be sure it holds," he muttered. But halfway up the stairs, the world tilted. He sat down hard on the step, dizzy, the hammer slipping from his fingers. The next thing he knew, he was lying on the floor of the living room. The lamp cast a soft halo above him, and he could hear the faint sound of whispering. Sophia telling Emma to fetch a blanket, Lily crying softly in the corner. His body felt made of stone. He tried to speak, to reassure them, but the words came out as a sigh. The warmth of the blanket, the touch of a small hand on his forehead, the murmured sound of his eldest daughter saying, "It's all right, Papa. Rest." These were the last things he remembered before sleep took him. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, pressing against the fragile house. Inside, the three girls huddled together, keeping watch. The fire burned low, its light tracing trembling lines across the walls. In the middle of the night, Lily tiptoed to her father's side and placed one of her drawings beside him, a picture of the house, with a sun above it, and 4 stick figures smiling. "So you have good dreams," she whispered, before curling up beside Sophia. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the world washed and silver. Thomas was still asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. The girls decided to surprise him by cleaning. They gathered brooms and rags, attacking the dust that had gathered in corners since the day they'd moved in. When they reached the small storage space under the stairs, Emma noticed something strange. The wood panel near the floor sounded hollow when she knocked on it. She tapped again, then called for Sophia. Together they pushed against it, and one of the boards shifted slightly, revealing a thin gap. Behind the panel, something glinted faintly in the dim light. Sophia pried it open further with the edge of a knife until the board came loose. Inside was a small metal box, rusted and covered with cobwebs. Lily clapped her hands in delight, as though they had found a treasure chest from one of her storybooks. Emma set it gently on the floor and wiped away the dust. The box was heavier than it looked. "Do you think it's money?" Lily whispered. "Or maybe letters?" Sophia hesitated, then lifted the lid. The hinges groaned. Inside, wrapped in a faded piece of cloth, were several old objects: rings, brooches, small silver coins, a pocket watch that no longer ticked, and a folded envelope, yellowed with age. The girls stared in silence. The air seemed to shift, heavy with something they couldn't name. Sophia unfolded the letter carefully. The ink was faded, but still legible, written in an elegant, looping hand. She read aloud in a trembling voice. "If this house still stands, then perhaps my faith was not in vain. These belong to the one who refuses to surrender, who builds rather than destroys. Let this help you, whoever you are. Do not spend it in greed, use it to create light." They sat quietly for a moment, the weight of the words filling the small space. Lily looked at the box with awe. "It's like he meant us," she said. "The house wanted us to find it." Sophia folded the letter again and placed it back inside. "We won't touch it until Papa wakes up," she said. "It's his to decide." Emma nodded solemnly. "He'll know what to do. He always does." The rest of the day passed in hushed anticipation. When Thomas finally stirred, the afternoon light had softened into gold. His head felt heavy, but the fever had broken. He blinked, disoriented, and saw his daughters sitting close together near the stove, the small metal box resting between them. "What's that?" he asked, his voice rough. Sophia brought it over and told him everything: the hollow wall, the box, the letter. Thomas listened, silent, his rough hands resting on his knees. When she finished, he reached for the letter and read it slowly. The handwriting trembled slightly where the ink had spread, but the words held a quiet strength. He looked at his daughters, then at the walls around him, at the house that had once felt like a burden and now seemed to be breathing beside them. "Maybe," he said softly, "this old place remembers the kind of people who fix things instead of running from them." He smiled faintly, though tears blurred his vision. "Maybe we were meant to be here." He placed the letter back into the box and closed the lid gently. "We'll do this right," he said. "We'll find out where it came from. We'll be honest about it. No hiding. No shortcuts. That's what your mother would have wanted." That evening, they ate together in silence, the fire crackling softly in the stove. The soup was thin again, but somehow it tasted richer. The girls kept glancing toward the box on the shelf, as if it might vanish. Thomas watched them, his chest heavy with a mixture of pride and wonder. He thought of how many times he'd cursed his luck, his weakness, the endless labor that seemed to lead nowhere. And yet, sitting there under the dim light, surrounded by the warmth of his daughter's laughter and the quiet presence of the house, he realized that something had already changed. Later, when everyone was asleep, he stayed awake by the dying fire. He reached for the letter again and read it once more. The words felt like a hand resting on his shoulder, steady, unseen, reassuring. He thought about the man who had written it, whoever he was, and about the strange way fate had of weaving lives together across decades. Maybe there was no such thing as coincidence. Maybe the house had simply been waiting for someone who could finish what had been started long ago. Outside, the wind had turned gentle. The shutters no longer rattled. The house seemed to sigh in its sleep, the wood settling with a faint creak. Thomas leaned back, eyes closing, and whispered, "All right, old friend. We'll keep going. You and me, we won't give up." He drifted to sleep there in the chair, the faint glow of embers reflecting on the box nearby. The house, still standing against the night, kept its quiet watch, as if guarding both the living and the memory of those who had once believed it could endure. Morning came with the gentle hum of spring, soft light slipping through the repaired windows and spilling across the wooden floorboards. For the first time since Thomas and his daughters had moved in, the house smelled not of dust and decay, but of coffee, soap, and new beginnings. Outside, the ground had thawed, and the first blades of grass pierced through the dark soil. Birds nested in the crooked eaves, singing as if they, too, approved of the change. Inside, Thomas sat at the kitchen table with the small metal box in front of him, its surface clean now, polished by Emma's careful hands. The letter lay unfolded beside it. He traced the faded handwriting with his finger, the old words still echoing in his mind. "Let this help you, whoever you are. Do not spend it in greed. Use it to create light." He had thought about those words for days. After consulting with a local historian and a lawyer, he discovered that the jewelry and coins were indeed old, some from the early 20th century, a few even older. They were valuable, but not priceless. The historian suggested donating the historical pieces to the town museum, which would give the family official recognition for the find. The rest could be legally sold, since no ownership records remained. Thomas agreed without hesitation. He wanted to do things the right way. For too long, his life had been shaped by circumstances he couldn't control. Now, for once, he wanted his choices to be clean. The sale brought in enough money to change their lives. It wasn't wealth, but it was freedom, the kind that allowed him to breathe without fear. He paid off what debts remained and bought proper tools, insulation for the walls, and a new water heater. When the contractor who once hired him learned about the find, he offered Thomas a better position, but Thomas refused. Instead, he decided to start his own small building crew, repairing homes for those who couldn't afford the big companies. He named it Gray and Daughters Restoration, painting the words on an old wooden sign that he hung by the gate. The neighbors, who had once laughed when he bought the house for pennies, now stopped by to watch him work. Some brought coffee, others asked for advice. "You've got a magic touch," one woman said, standing by the fence as Thomas rebuilt her porch for almost nothing. He smiled quietly, shaking his head. "No magic," he said. "Just a house that reminded me what not giving up looks like." At home, the girls were blooming in their own ways. Sophia kept a careful ledger of expenses and even helped design simple renovations, drawing neat diagrams in a notebook. Emma shadowed her father on the weekends, learning to use a level and tape measure, her small hand steady and serious. Lily spent her time in the garden, which had become her kingdom, a patch of earth where wildflowers grew among the vegetables. She still talked to the house sometimes, whispering to its walls as she watered the plants. Thomas once overheard her say, "You did good, you know. You picked us right." He didn't interrupt. He just smiled and went back to fixing the fence. By summer, The transformation was undeniable. The two-story house stood proud again, its paint warm and golden, the porch sturdy and straight. The garden was alive with color, and laughter drifted through the open windows at dusk. Inside, every room carried a trace of them, hand-sewn curtains, mismatched chairs, Lily's crayon drawings framed on the hallway wall. The house had not just been repaired, it had been reborn, and so had they. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Thomas sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The hammering from the nearby workshop faded as he leaned back, listening to the chorus of crickets. Sophia joined him, holding a stack of papers. "These are for school," she said shyly. "It's about architecture. They want us to write about something that inspires us." She handed him the pages, and he read the first line aloud. "Inspiration doesn't always come from beauty. Sometimes it comes from something broken that still chooses to stand." He looked up at her, pride swelling in his chest. "You'll go far," he said softly. "Further than I ever did." Sophia smiled. "Only because you showed me how to start." The summer gave way to autumn, and the small construction crew began to grow. Thomas hired 2 more men from the neighborhood, one a retired carpenter, the other a young man recently released from prison who couldn't find work elsewhere. "You sure about this?" the old carpenter asked. "He's got a record." Thomas shrugged. "So do most houses. Doesn't mean they can't be fixed." Together, they restored roofs, mended fences, and replaced windows across the town. Each finished job carried the same small brass plaque Emma designed, fixed discreetly near the doorway. The house that wouldn't give up. It became their quiet signature, a promise of resilience. As the leaves began to fall, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived, addressed in elegant handwriting. The sender was a woman named Martha Evans from a nearby town. She claimed to be the great-granddaughter of the house's original owner, Edward Rowe, the same initials engraved on the gold ring found in the box. "I heard about your discovery through the museum," she wrote. "I would like to visit the house if you'd allow it. It belonged to my family long ago, but it seems it finally found the right one." A week later, Martha arrived. She was in her late 70s, her movements slow but steady, her eyes sharp with curiosity. As she stepped onto the porch, she stopped, taking in the sight of the restored house. "It looks like it used to," she murmured. "My great-grandfather built this with his own hands. He lost everything in the fire of 1914 and buried what little he had left inside these walls, hoping someone would find it one day. He wrote letters to the house, as if it could hear him. We all thought he'd gone mad." Thomas guided her through the rooms, explaining what they had repaired and how they had lived there since. Martha listened quietly, touching the walls with her fingertips as though greeting an old friend. When she saw the framed letter from the box hanging by the staircase, she pressed a hand to her chest. "He wrote this," she whispered. "I recognize the words. He used to say them when I was a girl." Tears welled in her eyes. She turned to Thomas. "You've given his dream back to him. And to this house." Before she left, Martha took off a small pendant from around her neck, a delicate silver locket, tarnished by time. Inside was a faded photograph of the same man and woman from the picture Thomas had found in the kitchen months ago. "He would have wanted you to keep this," she said. "You finished what he started." Thomas tried to refuse, but she insisted. "It's not a gift. It's an acknowledgement." That evening, when the girls came home, he showed them the locket. Lily peered at it closely. "That's them," she said. "The people from the old photo." Thomas nodded. "Yes," he said softly. "And somehow, they're still here, watching over us." He hung the locket beside the framed letter at the bottom of the staircase, where sunlight touched it every morning. Years passed. The seasons turned and turned again, each one leaving its mark on the house. Sophia left for college to study architecture, just as she had dreamed. Emma began helping full-time with the business, managing clients and budgets with quiet confidence. Lily grew into a bright, curious teenager who loved sketching new house designs in her notebooks. The business expanded across the region, known not for grandeur, but for honesty and care. Families who couldn't afford much came to them, and Thomas never turned anyone away. "We fix homes," he liked to say, but really, we just helped them remember how to stand. One evening in early spring, years after the first night they'd slept on the bare floor, Thomas sat once more on the porch. The house was quiet, glowing in the soft light of dusk. He could hear the faint laughter of his daughters inside, now women with lives of their own. His hands were rougher, his hair flecked with gray, but his heart was steady. He looked out at the garden, now wild with flowers that had seeded themselves over time, and thought of that winter morning when they'd first arrived, cold, hungry, and lost. The memory felt distant, but not painful, like a scar that no longer ached. He closed his eyes and listened to the familiar creaks and murmurs of the house. It had its own language, a soft chorus of settling wood and sighing wind. "You've done well," he whispered. "You stood your ground." The old house answered him with a faint, slow groan, a sound not of protest, but of contentment. He smiled. When Sophia came outside to say goodnight, she found him still sitting there, gazing at the horizon. "Thinking again?" she teased gently. "Always," he said. "It's a builder's curse." She leaned against the railing beside him. "Do you ever think about selling it? You could have something newer, easier to maintain." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Sell it? After all it's been through? This place raised us as much as we rebuilt it." He paused, his gaze drifting toward the upstairs windows, where warm light glowed through the curtains. "No, Sophia. Some houses you don't own, they own you." The night deepened, and one by one, the lights in the windows went out. The moon rose, spilling silver across the roof. The air smelled faintly of earth and pine. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, and the echo faded into silence. Inside, the old floorboards creaked softly under the shifting air, the same familiar voice that had been with them since the beginning. Thomas whispered into the quiet, almost to himself. "We didn't just survive, old friend. We lived." And the house, standing strong against the gentle breath of wind, seemed to listen, content, whole and unbroken. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more real stories like this one. Watch the next video waiting for you right now, and share this one with someone who still believes that every home and every heart can be rebuilt.